About live here. So looks like we have maybe one viewer. That's cool. For anyone who's tuning into this or is watching it after the fact, we're going to talk a little bit about frameworks tonight. I was watching a Bible Thumping Wingnut video today where he was talking about, the title of the video was Atheism and Suicide. And of course that was a good lead in. That got me roped in a little bit. I actually saw it through someone else's Google Plus comment, and I'd seen that. And they were talking about, of course, atheism and how it's untenable, et cetera, et cetera. And the one thing that the Bible Thumping Wingnut had said was that he would like atheists to be consistent with their, I guess, worldview, and just be nihilists. And I would guess from the title, suicidal and maybe murderous, who knows. He sort of seemed to think that these things are consistent with atheism, that of course only if you accept the Christian God can you then account for love and empathy and morality, and of course by extension logic and reason and all the things that we know that that they would say go along with that. And it got me thinking quite a bit about the whole concept of frameworks, and I've invited Philosophical Vlogs tonight to chat a little bit about some of the potential frameworks that could account for some of these things, not necessarily even atheistic frameworks, although we will, but other frameworks as well, other maybe spiritual frameworks that could easily account for these things. It would not require the Christian God or any of the other monotheistic deities to account for them, and sort of show that, you know, obviously the Bible Thumping Wingnut's sentiments, I think, are a little bit disingenuous, and I'm not sure why he goes to such pains to say things like that, because there's no way in which he could have exhausted all the potential frameworks that could be, including the ones that we are unaware of, and then have invalidated them all in favor of his chosen framework. And the only issue that I have with that is he doesn't leave room for one iota of doubt there, of possibility that he may be incorrect. I would be fine if he said, I'm 99 and 44 100% sure that my framework is accurate and that the rest of you are wrong. I'm actually okay with that. What I'm not okay with is saying, deciding for other people, of course, that their framework is untenable without really understanding it. He's really misrepresenting other people's way of thinking. Not to mention, as I've said in videos previous, that there's an integrity in I don't know. And I've used the Pele example many times. I would use it again. If all the people of the day are saying that volcanic eruptions are due to a goddess named Pele, and you're not buying it, it doesn't mean that you have to accept their framework just because you haven't provided a framework that actually explains you can't account for volcanic eruptions. Yes, I can, right? And the same goes with love and empathy and morality and logic and reason. My argument would be I can account for those things because I use them and I witness them. So I know that they exist. I can't actually account for the Christian God. Now, can I account for these things ultimately? Well, I believe I have an accounting for them, but even if I did not, I can. They are in evidence, so the only thing that I can do is say, well, I know there must be an accounting for them. This one does not satisfy me. It doesn't seem to be accurate to me, so my mind is open from this point forward. Good evening, Mike. How's it going?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like you're the dude to do this particular hangout with because you're probably one of the most open-minded people that I know, and you know, I don't quite often stray into, you know, Eastern mysticism or anything on my channel, of course, or even some of the things that I was kind of brought up with very often, because I'm not making the case for those things. But I think in this instance, it pays to be a little bit open-minded and admit that there are things that we don't know, and sort of talk a little bit about some of the potential frameworks that could account for love and empathy and morality and all these things that wouldn't require a monotheistic deity, right?
Well, you know, one thing, and this might sound like a cop-out, it might not be persuasive to the presuppositionalist, but as Bonson pointed out, proof is not the same as persuasion, right? And so I don't have to persuade other people in order for me to prove something. Not that I'm trying to prove something here, but one thing that it's very simple, but I would say, why do we have to account for things? There's this assumption, there's this, it's just taken for granted. It's like, let's say that I'm living my life. Let's say I'm outside and I'm building a campfire, not to burn my child, but I'm just building a campfire, enjoying nature, and just sitting here. And then all of a sudden, someone from some other tribe, some other nation comes along, and he says, "You need to account for the laws of logic." I'm like, why? I mean, why do I have to account for the laws of logic? So just one thing I'd like to say is just a simple point of, why do we have to account for things? I mean, I'm living my life and it seems to be okay, and so it doesn't really matter in one sense that I couldn't account for something according to the you know satisfaction of a presuppositionalist. So that's one thing I would say. Um, there's another thing I wanted to say too. As far as accounting for the laws of logic, the presuppositionalists would say, well, the Christian God or the Christian worldview is that which accounts for the laws of logic. Now, of course, you see, this can lead to an infinite regression. Because why should I accept that we have to take, well, why should I accept that we have to account for just this one level here? Why couldn't I go further and say, okay, well then how do we account for the Christian God? And that doesn't seem like an intelligible question to the presuppositionalist, I don't think. It's like, well, no, that we can just stop there. God is that which accounts for everything else. But why can you stop there? Why can't I just say that I presuppose the laws of logic in order to account for experience? Why can't they themselves be that which account for the intelligibility of human experience, rather than saying what accounts for the laws of logic? Oh, it's God. Why? It seems like this arbitrary step to say, okay, well, you're going to have to account for it on this one level, but if you ask me to go further, no, I'm just going to say I can just stop with God. Well, I'm just going to say I stop with the laws of logic. Why do I have to go further than that?
Yeah, that's a good.
The laws of logic are presuppositional, or they are a presuppositional issue. I would say, you don't go out into nature and find the law of logic, the law of non-contradiction, growing in someone's garden. It's, like Bonson would like to say, you can't stub your toe on a law of logic. You can't go to the grocery store and buy a six-pack of laws of logic. They're not physical things. We presuppose the laws of logic. We don't discover them in our experience. It's not an empirical thing. We don't go out and observe nature and see the laws of logic. We presuppose them in order to make sense out of human language, for example. Like, we're presupposing them in order to make this conversation intelligible. So why can't we just stop there? Why do I need a worldview that is Christian theistic in order to account for these things? One thing that I would agree with the presuppositionalist is I would agree that we don't. I would agree that naturalism would not account for the laws of logic, and the reason being is that if you say that all is matter, then you're logically saying there are no laws of logic, unless you're going to say that the laws of logic are matter, which is absurd, because they're not. They're immaterial. So, yeah, so I would make those two basic points and say, why do we have to count for things? Because some presuppositionalist says that we have to. I don't have to. So what? Second of all, we either have the problem of an infinite regression, saying, okay, how do you account for logic? Well, God. Okay, well, how do you account for God? Well, no, we just stop there. He's eternal. He accounts for everything else. Well, that's arbitrary. So Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that I've touched on a little bit before with the bit of a tap dance I see with the presuppositionalist in that they will call themselves presuppositionalists, but they act as though they don't require presuppositions, that they've solved the problem of infinite regression by making an appeal to a revelation from an omnipotent deity. But again, and then they'll sort of act as though we're the ones with the problem, with the regression problem, when we're saying, well, no, we presuppose laws of logic, cognitive faculties, et cetera, et cetera. And they act as though they've sort of trumped, but there's no trumping here. They certainly haven't solved the issue. And it's almost like they're sidestepping the presupposition that they're making, right? They're pretending not to be requiring a presupposition.
Well, it
But
may
they
seem
are.
that way to you, but I mean, I'm speaking from a perspective of when I speak of presuppositionalism, I'm in my mind, I'm referring mostly to what I've learned from Greg Bahnsen,
Right. And
primarily,
that should be
or
distinguished.
Greg
Yeah.
Bahnsen type presuppositionalism, not necessarily those who are on YouTube, just
Right.
any given person who says they're a presuppositionalist. So I'm not, rather than speaking for them or addressing all the particular people who say they're presuppositionalists, I would say, well, Bahnsen would admit, oh, we have presuppositions as Christians. We're not denying that we have presuppositions. We're just saying that the Christian worldview, presuppositions of the Christian worldview, are that which account for the intelligibility of human experience. They account for moral absolutes. They account for human dignity. They account for um, the laws of logic. They account for the uniformity of nature, uh, and so forth. Um,
Right.
so the point is that look, he would make the point that look, we all have presuppositions. It's just that the non-Christian worldview, or any given non-Christian worldview, uh, reduces to being self-refuting, or it can't account for these things in our human experience. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I don't see the presuppositional perspective, um, not admitting that they have presuppositions.
Right. I follow. Yeah, I follow what you're saying, and I am thinking, of course, about more of the YouTube on-air personalities. So let's get to those.
Okay.
So again, we're referencing a video by the Bible Thumping Wingnut where he had challenged atheists to be more consistent with their worldview and be nihilistic, I guess. And the title of the video was "Atheism and Suicide" or something like that. So what would your response be to someone saying, be more consistent with your worldview and be consistent with atheism because atheism cannot account for empathy and love and morality? What would your response be to that?
Well, one thing I can say is that in order to, I think, make that argument better, so to say, meaning if we're going to go along with this type of argument and follow this train of thought, I would say it would make more sense to say that nothing follows from atheism. Not, oh, well, if there is no, if the Christian God doesn't exist, then you should just kill yourself. Well, no, that wouldn't even follow. Why should I kill myself? Killing yourself seems to presuppose that there's some sort of purpose in doing so. There's some sort of meaning or fulfillment in doing that. So I mean, if from a presuppositional perspective, atheism is absurd. It's irrational. It makes nonsense of human experience, and so nothing would follow from it. So it wouldn't even make sense to say I'm going to kill myself because that's consistent with atheism. I mean, why? Why even do that? So that's one thing I would say, and secondly, I would say, well, what is my worldview? Why don't you tell me what my worldview is? I mean, just because I say that I don't believe in the Christian God doesn't mean you know anything positively about what my worldview is. So
Yeah.
how can you say, well, if the Christian God doesn't exist, or if atheism is true, which is kind of a weird way of putting it, if atheism is true, then you should just kill yourself. I mean, you see, let's take it away from the high-minded intellectual philosophicalness here for a moment, and let's bring it out back to the campfire scene. A lot of times we can spend so much time being so philosophical and just over intellectual in our minds. It's so abstract that we can get tied up in all these intellectual problems in our minds, and we can overanalyze this. How do we account for this? How do we account for that? It's like, look, you can live your life not knowing where the universe came from, not knowing where man came from, and you can look up at the stars and wonder and be excited to figure it out. It's to just say, well, you don't have an answer that satisfies me, to replace the Christian worldview to my satisfaction. Therefore, the implication of your worldview is just suicide. Dude, why? Secondly, or maybe this is thirdly, I don't know. If Christianity is true, one could at least attempt to make the argument to say, well, if Christianity is true, you might as well just kill yourself. I mean, if there's this horrible asshole God, and he's saying, look, repent or perish, I'm going to torture you forever unless you worship me, to simplify it, then you might as well just knock yourself off, because you're going to go to hell anyway, and it would be better for you to go there earlier and have less judgment than to live a longer life and acquire more judgment for yourself, because all you're going to do is just sin more. And if you live another 50 years, you're just going to have 50 more years of sin. So, I mean, anyone can make this argument and say, well, if you don't agree with me, then you might as well just kill yourself. That's just a claim. I mean, I didn't see the video, so I don't really know if he develops the argument any further than just claiming if atheism is true, you should kill yourself.
Yeah, he didn't actually, I don't think he said that in the video, it was just in the video title, but what he did say, of course, is if you're going to be an atheist and you're going to be consistent with your worldview, then you're sort of reduced to nihilism. And you would have to abandon love and morality and empathy and whatnot. I did just want to say before we go too much further, we've got a few viewers here, and I am going to open up the invites in a little bit here, maybe 20, 25 minutes or something like that. I'd like to chat with Philosophical Vlogs for a little bit first, and then we'll invite some other folks in. So I will be sending out some invites in a little bit, but I did want to just chat with Mike for a little bit first and get his unique take on things before we open the room. So I certainly agree with you, Mike, when it comes to why do I have to have a framework before I can sort of accept the use of these tools, right? I think the vast majority of human beings that have ever lived have experienced empathy and love and morality and used, critical thinking and rational thought and all that without ever actually contemplating what the basis for those things was. I mean, we have those things in evidence. Those are tools, and through a process of empiricism and exploration and cross-verification and all that, we can verify that those things all function. And again, going back to the Pele example, I don't need to have a framework to be able to say, there is a lava flow heading for me right now, I'm going to book it out of here, right? I don't need to have a framework that explains that, and I don't have to accept the Pele framework for me to know what I need to do in the moment. And I think the same thing holds true for these frameworks, for sure. When it comes to the naturalistic worldview, maybe you could enlighten me a little bit. I was thinking about that. Okay, what frameworks? Okay, first of all, we don't need a framework to account for these things. Why do I have to account for these things? But secondarily, what frameworks could account for all of these different things? And you mentioned naturalism earlier, and are you aware of sort of like different strains of naturalism, like a hard naturalism and a soft naturalism? Because I've heard this bandied about quite a bit before, and I've also heard people talk about it more of a soft naturalism where, all is matter or product of matter. So in other words, a thought is immaterial, but it is still a product of matter. It still qualifies.
So, like, if somebody were to say that the mind is not identical to the brain, but the mind is sort of the activity of the brain, the
Exactly. Yeah.
product of the brain. Okay. Well, I would. Something interesting that Bonson pointed out. This is sort of related. I've said this to you before, but Bonson, in talking about evolution, he went through, and of course, the evolutionists like to correct, creationists and say, well, evolution just has to do with, life, evolving. It doesn't have to do with the Big Bang and all that sort of thing. But taking an evolutionary, a common perspective of someone who's an atheist, a naturalist, an evolutionist, and says, okay, well, there was the Big Bang, and then, billions and billions of years ago, and then eventually you got the Earth, and eventually then life forms, and so forth and so forth. Let's take that perspective and just think about that. Well, what you have here is just a bundle of irrational things happening. You have, and this is debatable, something coming from nothing. Of course, there's that whole debate of, well, nothing doesn't really mean nothing as we usually think of it, but let's skip over that one. What you have is life coming from non-life. Right? You have intelligence coming from non-intelligence. You have morality coming from non-morality. Right? You have freedom coming from non-freedom, if you believe there's any sort of freedom, unless you're a determinist. But the point here is that how do you have one thing producing the exact opposite of itself? Does it make any sense to talk about one kind of thing, matter? Matter is in the realm of, distance and space and, this physical world. To say that something is, that non-matter, well, what are we talking about then? What do you mean non-matter? I mean, matter producing non-matter? So our mind is not matter, it's the product of matter. Well, how does matter produce its exact opposite? Are we really suggesting that? It seems irrational.
Well, yeah, I suppose if you're assuming that non-matter is the opposite of matter, right? The absence of matter being the opposite of matter may not necessarily be.
Well, if the product of the mind is not matter, or if the product of the brain is not the brain, it's not, or is it matter or is it not? Is the mind matter or not? What are we referring to here?
Yeah, yeah. I follow what you're saying. Yeah.
So usually when I say naturalism, what I'm saying is someone who's saying all that exists is matter. It's just the material, physical world. There is no spiritual realm. There is no immaterial.
Well,
There's
yeah,
there's no God because all is matter. He's
and I
spirit.
think
That's not matter.
as you've correctly pointed out before, that very concept nullifies itself, right? It's a self-refuting concept because this concept itself is not made of matter.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and so if someone is going to say that all is matter, well, first of all, I'd like to point out that saying all is matter is a presuppositional standpoint. That is not something that is the conclusion of science. That is not the conclusion of going out into the world and observing things, because you have not observed everything. So to say that everything is matter, that's a presupposition. You don't know that. To say that everything is made up of atoms, for example,
That's a good
well,
point.
where do you get this idea from? You're assuming this. I mean, why do you assume that the nature of reality across the board is atoms? And I'd say there's problems with this as well. I mean, if everything is just the same thing, how do we have variety? If everything is one, how is everything not one?
Well, I guess the question would be, can you see, without sticking to a rigid sort of hard naturalism, can you see a framework that would, over obviously a long period of time, actually account for these things, right? So for instance, and I mean, obviously I think there is, because the scientists believe that they've determined that, right? They've determined, we started off with, with just, I don't know, one or two elements, and you know what I mean, through the process of star formation, et cetera, these things have changed, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is there is a framework there. I think even to abiogenesis, to evolution, to the evolution of social species, right? Um, I think there
I
is.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
think so. There may
No.
be, but me personally, I all of that is just seems like speculation to me. Now, it could be because of my ignorance. It could be because, I have not, spent hours and hours studying these, you know, these peer-reviewed papers or whatever, dealing
Well,
with
yeah, I would say
star formation.
yeah, speculation might not be all that charitable a term for the amount of research that's gone into it, right?
Well, do we observe stars forming?
Well, to a degree. I mean, you know, the same argument is made, right, about you know the orbit of the outer planets, right? That we've not actually observed a complete orbit yet. We, you know, have calculated, right,
Well, yeah, and
through observation.
I would say take me down that path. I'm fine with saying, well, we don't even know. How do we even know any of these other things about space? I mean, fill me in here, scientists.
Right.
And they can, we can let them speak if they want to speak for themselves and tell us how they know these things or why they think these things. Then fine. But for me, and I think for the average person at least, that even if the scientists themselves who study these things know this through observation, well, I certainly don't. So I mean, at the end of the
Sure.
day, we're just relying on what we're being told by current scientific investigation, which may change in 100 years.
Right. Right.
So
Okay, so I'd like to move on from this point, but what I did want to just say is I think that there is at least a framework there that's been put together by the scientific community that could explain uh, all of these things that we're talking about. You know, the evolution of our social species, abiogenesis, all of that. You know, cosmology, and I think that there is a framework there, of course. Um, and what I would like to do though is ask you then, aside from sort of saying, well, you know, I don't necessarily have to provide a framework. Can you see any other? Well, what do you think about the potentiality for frameworks that would explain all of these things that we have not yet discovered as a species?
can you give me an example? Uh, or you mean like the laws of logic, for example? How do we account for that?
Sure, sure.
Well, I think that the laws of logic are eternal. It makes no sense to think that they somehow evolved that way. Evolution seems to be a part of the natural world. Um, and having physical things developing, I don't have a problem with that. In principle, that makes sense. I can see how human beings and gorillas and monkeys could descend from a common ancestor. I could see that. But as far as the laws of logic, I don't see how if all we have to work with here is just the physical world evolving, I don't think you can get from that the laws of logic. Because my understanding of the law of non-contradiction, for example, that's not something that is changing. That's something that is not a physical object. Um, and so I would just say it seems to me that this is just eternal. And if we ask, well, how is this the case? It's eternal. How else? I mean, you can't really say where it came from if it's eternal, right? It's sort of like if you believe in God, it's sort of like, well, asking the question where did God come from just doesn't even make sense if God is eternal. One thing I like to say is that there's this assumption on the presuppositional perspective that we have to appeal to outside of ourselves in order to account for our own experience. Say, well, why do we have to do that? I mean, I accept that I'm eternal. Throw me in the loony bin, but beyond the human changing illusion that I am as a human person, I believe that I am eternal consciousness. and of course there will be people here who wouldn't agree with me. That's fine. I don't care. But for me, in my mind, if you're asking me, well, how would you make sense of these things if we don't take the Christian perspective? I would say, look, I don't have to appeal to outside of myself. I'm perfectly fine with saying, look, as consciousness, as awareness, why can't these certain laws of thought just be eternally the way they are within consciousness? And that may sound arbitrary. They might say, you might say, well, that doesn't solve the problem. You need to account for it. Fine, satisfies me. And I would point out again that otherwise, if it's not okay to reach a point where we just say this is it, this is the eternal thing that accounts for everything else, then we have the problem of an infinite regression.
Yeah,
So I mean, it's kind
yeah,
of it's difficult. I mean, how do
yeah,
you answer these questions?
at that point, everyone's making an arbitrary claim, right? And so
Yeah, arguably. Yeah.
who's to say whose arbitrary claim holds more weight? And I will just say, and I think we'll move it. I'll open it up pretty soon here and send some invites out. But I will just say and just dive a little bit into my own background with relation to that, because I think, and I'm not making a case for it because I'm not sure where I stand anymore, but it does provide a framework that would explain all of these things: love, empathy, beauty, morality, logic, reason, the whole shebang. And that is when I was younger. My mom used to read a lot of Jane Roberts' books, Seth Speaks series, where she was channeling some sort of a spirit entity from another realm. And I mean, we're talking about voluminous books, certainly more pages than the Old and New Testament, I think, really. There's a lot of material there, very, very well laid out framework that does explain all of those things, that does give us a framework that says basically that we are all consciousness and that we are co-creators of our experience, and that we are all here, sort of experiencing different things. And it's very, very interesting. Now, again, I'm not making the case for it because, again, I don't know where I stand anymore. I think I'm kind of in the same place as you, in that, at the very least, I very much hope that I am eternal consciousness, because I don't like the idea of the party shutting down for me at some point, as I think Christopher Hitchens once said, the party going on without him. I don't like that idea. I like the idea of exploring, and so I think I'm still leaning that way, but I honestly don't know. And I'm actually okay with not knowing, because I sort of feel like if I don't know right now, then maybe I'm not supposed to know. Maybe that's okay. I think the tragedy would be to sort of live your life uh, for that, for the other world, for the other realm, for the other possibilities, when clearly what I am meant to do is, live this life right now. I'm meant to get up tomorrow morning and have a cup of coffee and some breakfast and enjoy some time with my wife, walk the dog, et cetera, right? But that is what I was raised with, actually, to some degree. Peripherally, my parents didn't foist anything on me. She was reading these books and she would talk about it with my dad in front of me, and I would hear these things. But it does provide a framework that would satisfy all these things, and it would be something I would consider to be an atheistic framework. In other words, at the very least, it doesn't involve a monotheistic deity.
Yeah.
Maybe in a roundabout way, it would involve all of us as gods, as co-creators in that sense. I still find it highly interesting, and if you ever get the chance to read any of the stuff, it's very thorough. I mean, if this woman is sort of imagining all of this, she's got quite an imagination.
Yeah. Well, can I say one thing about like the empathy or love sort of thing? Like, if somebody asks me, well, how do you account for this? Why should we be loving? Well, take for example, let's say I'm walking along and there's a cat sitting on the floor. Why is it that I don't just jump up and stomp on the cat's head? Like, it is entirely within me that I don't want to do that because I don't want to harm the cat. You can call it arbitrary. You can say, well, you can't account for this. Well, so what? I am what I am. And the reason is not outside of me. It's not some God above me that's saying, don't do that. Or it's wrong because it's contrary to my character. I would say it's wrong because it's contrary to my character. And that's just the way it is. So if we want to be real here and practical of why we're really doing what we're doing, I'd say, well, at the end of the day, what I'm doing is because of me. It flows from my nature, not some other nature above me who's dictating to me, do this and don't do this. Because even if that were the case, I still could say, fuck you. Because what if he says, step on the cat's head? Well, see, we can account for morality, and guess what? The character of this eternal God is stepping on cats' heads. Well, then fine, then call me immoral. If that's what morality is, then I'll be immoral. So we run into a semantic thing too with the whole morality thing. What is morality? What are we talking about here? So.
Yeah, I guess obviously the challenge that they're going to bring there is, well, as you mentioned, you're just talking, okay, why should we listen to you? It's all subjective, and I don't think they really give enough credence to intrasubjectivity, right?
There is no, and I would say there is no, you should listen to me. I live my life. I'm on this journey of life, and like you were mentioning about the journey of life, you want to have coffee with your wife and that sort of thing, and you say that you don't know, but you want to know, and life is here for us to figure these things out. And so if we all just didn't have a life, it would just be eternally, I know everything. I know everything. I know everything. I know everything. So somehow there's this illusion, this journey, there's this changing realm that we're in my opinion, and it's part of just is what it is. Why can't we just accept or be content with the fact that we're living our life and we're on our journey, and let's be open and talk about these things, and I think that's cool. But let me one more thing. Let me just kind of, because someone might say, well, this just doesn't satisfy it. You're not giving an answer that's sufficient. You're not giving us a worldview that accounts for these things. Well, so what? Really. At the end of the day, so what? If you're hammering your hammer into the nail, into the wood, you're doing what you're doing, man. It just is. And someone can say, well, you can't account for this. All right. And it doesn't bother me. Like it bothers the presuppositionalist that people can't account for these things in the way that they would like them to. So what? Especially on my view, if I am eternal consciousness, why do I have to satisfy anybody else in this illusion of life?
Yeah, and
I can just have a Google Hangout and enjoy talking about it.
Right.
Well, what if I don't have all the answers?
Yeah.
I don't care.
For sure, and I totally agree with that, and I think there's a lot of integrity in saying, yeah, I don't have all the answers, and I don't have to, but I do utilize the tools, and so I can utilize those tools to interpret, claims that are made and say, that's internally contradictory, or that's got that doesn't resonate with me, and reject that. And I don't see anything wrong with that. Again, what we do have in evidence are the tools. Those things are in evidence. Again, I don't have to account for the lava flow to decide to get the hell out of its way. For instance. I have opened up the room here. I've sent out some invites, so hopefully we can get someone in to join us and weigh in on the subject here.